Imagine a cold November morning in a vast palace in the heart of Vienna, with halls decorated in gold and tapestries that told stories of kings and conquests. The smell of melting wax candles and floral perfumes filled the corridors, while the Austrian court anxiously awaited news. It was November 20, 1755, and an archduchess had just been born who would change the destiny of France. If you're already imagining yourself in this scenario, hold on tight, because this story is just beginning. Take advantage and subscribe to the channel. Leave a like to support and comment below. Do you think someone's destiny is already mapped out from birth? Let's find out together. Maria Antonia Josepha Johanna was born the 15th of 16 children of the powerful Empress Maria Theresa of Austria, one of the most influential women in Europe at the time. Her father was Emperor Francis I, and the name Maria was traditionally given to all daughters of the Habsburg dynasty, a symbol of devotion to the Virgin Mary. But despite her imperial blood, little Maria Antonia's early life was anything but luxurious. She was raised in a strict environment, full of protocols, but with a very different routine from the one she would face years later in Versailles. Although she lived in a palace, the Archduchess's childhood was simpler than many people imagine. Royal children learned music, dance, languages, and etiquette, but they also lived with strict teachers and had few freedoms. Maria Antonia, in particular, was seen as a charismatic, charming girl, but not exactly the most diligent. As a child, she loved to dance, play the harp, and sing, and had a penchant for mischief. She was known for her beauty from an early age, with expressive blue eyes and wavy blonde hair, which caught the attention of even the foreign diplomats who frequented the court. But make no mistake, the little Archduchess's life was not a fairy tale. As the daughter of the Empress, she was first and foremost a political pawn on the grand European chessboard. And little by little, as she played in the corridors of the Hofburg, her mother was already plotting what would be her destiny: to marry her to a French prince, sealing a powerful alliance between two nations that had been rivals for centuries. And so, while Maria Antonia's innocent heart still beat lightly at the children's parties at court, the world was already preparing her for a distant throne, a foreign language, and a life she could never have imagined. When Maria Antonia was only 14 years old, she was still a young girl, full of dreams and innocence. She danced in the ballrooms of Vienna, wrote letters by hand with flowery ribbons, and smiled with the lightness of someone who had never imagined the weight of a crown. But the truth is that at that very moment, destiny was already knocking on her door, and it came with the seal of France. The alliance between the two greatest powers in Europe, Austria and France, was more than a chess move, it was a survival move. And to seal this deal, there was nothing better than a royal wedding. The chosen one, the grandson of the French King Louis XV, a shy, introspective 15-year-old with a future title, Louis XVI. Marie Antoinette, who still stumbled over the rules of etiquette, had to undergo a true transformation before she was considered worthy of the French court. Her teeth were straightened, her posture corrected, her education reinforced. She had to learn French to perfection and master the strict protocols of Versailles. Within a few months, her Austrian identity was gently erased so that she could be reborn as Marie Antoinette, the future Queen of France. The wedding was actually a double one. First, it took place remotely, by proxy in Vienna, with an archduke representing the groom. Then she embarked on a long journey to France, crossing borders and leaving behind her family, her language, and the life she knew. Along the way, she was stripped of everything that was still Austrian: clothes, servants, objects. At the border, she was dressed in French attire as a symbol of her new identity. The official ceremony took place on May 16, 1770. At the Palace of Versailles, Marie Antoinette arrived at the court surrounded by expectations, but was greeted with suspicious looks. After all, she was a foreigner. But that day, in front of the church packed with nobles, amidst golden columns and lace veils, the young Austrian woman became the Dauphine of France, the title given to the wife of the heir to the throne. But the fairy tale soon began to show its cracks. Despite the pomp of their wedding, Her relationship with Louis was anything but textbook. He was withdrawn, insecure, and had very different interests from hers. While Marie Antoinette wanted to dance, socialize, and discover life at court, young Louis preferred his quiet pastimes, hunting, studying maps, and picking locks. And what's more, the marriage took years to be consummated, something that at the time caused scandal. The entire court whispered, and rumors spread. Does the king not like the queen? Is there something wrong with him, or is she the problem? Pressure came from all sides, including from their families. The situation was embarrassing, awkward, and dangerous. And so, as the young queen tried to adapt to a cold and rule-bound court, her marriage became the subject of jokes and gossip. Little did she know that these same rumors would become the beginning of a huge snowball effect, one that would swallow her name, her throne, and her head. Versailles may have seemed like an enchanted palace, but to Marie Antoinette, newly married and just 14 years old, it felt more like a gilded prison. Arriving as a foreign starlet, she soon found herself surrounded by stifling rules, judgmental gazes, and a scandal-hungry court. And there was one problem, a big problem that everyone kept talking about. Her marriage to Louis had not yet been consummated. For the time, this was more than a private matter. It was a crisis of state. The royal marriage was not just a union of two people, but an alliance between two powers, and without an heir, the future of the French monarchy was uncertain. The pressure was unbearable. At every party where Marie Antoinette appeared smiling, someone would whisper, "She pretends well, but what about the Dauphin? Still nothing?" With each absence of the king, another malicious theory would emerge. Meanwhile, Louis XVI, still shy and insecure, avoided any emotional exposure. He was reserved, uncomfortable with his wife, and showed little interest in intimacy. Today, historians believe that the young king may have had a mild medical condition or even severe anxiety. What is known for sure is that it took him 7 years to consummate the marriage. 7 years of speculation, of letters from Marie Antoinette's mother pressuring him, of embarrassing advice from the court, and of public humiliation that the teenage queen was forced to endure. And in the midst of it all, she tried to maintain her poise. But those who look at portraits of Marie Antoinette from that time, with her carefully constructed hairstyles and impeccable dresses, might not realize, behind that smile, there was frustration, loneliness, and fear. And like any young woman, she sought a way to escape. She began to seek refuge in balls, card games, nighttime walks, and dangerous friendships at court. It was a way of forgetting, for a few hours, that the throne she occupied still had no firm ground, and that any false step could sink her for good. But this need for distraction, for freedom, would turn against her very soon. Because it was precisely during this period that Marie Antoinette immersed herself in a life of parties, expensive clothes, and escapism, which would make her a target of public opinion. When Marie Antoinette finally became Queen of France, she was only 19 years old, young, beautiful, witty, and surrounded by an empire of gold, lush dresses, and eyes watching her every step. The Palace of Versailles, where she lived, was a true work of art, immense, decorated with mirrors, rare marble, and gardens meticulously trimmed like living paintings. But it was also a place where image was worth more than truth. Life there was a daily play. Everything was a ritual, from the moment of waking up to the moment of getting dressed, eating, or even giving birth. Everything had an audience, and Marie Antoinette, newly arrived at the top, was swallowed up by this performance. To protect herself, she created her own stage. Dresses made of yards of hand-embroidered fabric, hairstyles so high they needed internal reinforcement with wire, shoes lined with silk, and jewelry that reflected the light from the chandeliers like stars. Her appearance became her armor and her obsession. She set fashions, influenced the women of the court, and even created new trends. What she wore today, the entire elite wanted tomorrow. But there was a problem. It cost a lot. The queen bought dresses by the bucket load, spent fortunes on shoemakers and jewelers, and had hairdressers and personal stylists. What's more, she had an exclusive space built inside Versailles just to take refuge from the rigidity of the court, the Petit Trianon, a mansion where she was the queen of her own world, with the freedom to do whatever she wanted. And it didn't stop there. Inside this refuge, she had a play village created, the Hameau de la Reine, a mini farm with farmers' houses, chickens, goats, and even hired washerwomen, all so that she and her ladies could pretend to be peasants. That's right, she pretended to live like the people, while the real people barely had enough bread to eat. Over time, people began to murmur, "She spends as if money were infinite. While we are starving, she changes her dress 3 times a day." The queen began to be called Madame Deficit, a cruel but increasingly common criticism. Her image as a fairy became that of a cold and vain witch. But for Marie Antoinette, it was all an escape. The court was suffocating, the marriage was cold, and the pressure was constant. Luxury for her was a distraction, but for the people, it was provocation. And that's when the question that echoes to this day was born. Did she really not know what was happening outside the palace walls? Or did she simply not care? The more Marie Antoinette shone inside the palace, the more her image faded outside. The French people, who were facing cold and hunger, looked at the queen and saw something very different from a maternal and protective figure. They saw luxury, they saw waste, they saw a distant woman, covered in diamonds, who seemed to live in a world where the suffering of others did not exist. And here begins a crucial turn in history. Over time, the newspapers of the time, called pamphlets or libels, began to publish scandalous stories about her. And here's the thing, these weren't ordinary newspapers. They were sensationalist, outrageous, and often full of lies, but people read them and they believed them. They began to circulate cartoons of the queen in obscene poses, texts insinuating adultery, political betrayal, and even witchcraft. They said that she slept with noblemen, ladies, and anyone who passed by. Was that an exaggeration? Yes, but the damage was done. The pamphlets painted Marie Antoinette as a vain, wanton, and above all, foreign woman. This was very important. She was Austrian, and France had always looked askance at any foreign influence. She has come to destroy France, they said. She is the spy of Vienna, they shouted in the taverns. None of these accusations was proven, but as you know, in politics and gossip, it is the impression that counts. And how did she respond to all this? With silence. She was not allowed to defend herself publicly. The role of the queen was that of silent royalty, impeccable appearance, measured words, elegant gestures, and this only fed the monster of public opinion, because if she did not deny it, maybe it was true. Meanwhile, the people saw bread disappearing from the shelves, taxes were rising, inequality was growing, and the queen, in the eyes of the crowd, continued to have fun at masked balls, wearing dresses that cost a year's wages for an ordinary worker. All this created an image. Marie Antoinette became the symbol of oppression, indifference, and excess. You've probably heard this phrase, "If they don't have bread, let them eat cake." It's still repeated today in movies, books, memes, and classrooms as the ultimate symbol of the royal family's coldness toward the people's suffering, and the name most associated with it is, without a doubt, Marie Antoinette. But what if I told you she probably never said that? That's right, this phrase first appears in a book by philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau, written when Marie Antoinette was still a 9-year-old child and didn't even live in France. In the excerpt, Rousseau says that he heard a certain great princess say that when she learned that the people had no bread. The problem is that he never mentions the princess's name, and much later, with the queen already at the center of the controversy, people simply decided that the princess was her. But why? Because the phrase fit perfectly into the narrative that was growing around her, that of a queen disconnected from reality, living in a parallel world, full of lace, wigs, and champagne, while the people were bleeding from hunger. It was simple, direct, powerful, and even without proof, it was enough to set the already revolted hearts of the crowd on fire. For the people, the truth mattered little. What mattered was the symbol, and Marie Antoinette was the perfect symbol of the decadence of the monarchy. And as in every good tragedy, the more she tried to hide in the silence of royalty, the more her figure became the target of criticism, legends, and revolt. The phrase became a headline, a poster, a battle cry, and even without having said it, Marie Antoinette would pay dearly for it. But that would not be the only pain that would affect her in the following years, because behind the image of a vain woman, there was also a devoted mother, and the pain that she would experience as a mother, no queen, no crown, no silk dress, would be able to alleviate. Versailles was more than a palace, it was a game board. Every gesture, every look, every approach carried stakes. Amidst all this, Marie Antoinette, young, exposed, and often lonely, found solace where few expected, in the friendship of two women who would change her life and her reputation. The first was Marie-Louise de Lamballe, a sweet, elegant, and extremely loyal Italian princess. They soon became inseparable. Lamballe was discreet, protective, and was appointed superintendent of the Queen's household, a title of utmost prestige among the ladies. It was the kind of friendship that in a court full of masks seemed genuine. The second was Yolande de Polignac, a completely different woman, intelligent, bold, engaging, and ambitious. Marie Antoinette was enchanted by her charismatic personality and free spirit, to the point of giving up conventions to place her in prominent positions. Polignac began to frequent the Petit Trianon, benefited financially, and became the Queen's closest advisor. But here comes the problem. The court started talking a lot. They said that Marie Antoinette was surrounded by an inner circle that gave more orders than ministers. They accused Polignac of manipulating political decisions. They accused Lamballe of having too much influence. And most importantly, they insinuated that there was more than friendship between them. Pamphlets were circulated with obscene illustrations, malicious rumors, and veiled accusations. Lesbians, conspirators, vampires of the Queen. The truth? It was probably just friendship, yes, but the damage to their public image was irreversible. To the people, it all seemed like yet another sign of corruption and decadence, and for the Queen herself, these friendships, which were her emotional refuge, ended up becoming yet another burden on her reputation. Still, Marie Antoinette never abandoned either of them. When everything fell apart, they both stood by her side, and one of them would pay with her own life for that loyalty. But despite the scandals and pressure, there was one place where the Queen found peace, with her children. Behind the flawless makeup, the dresses embroidered with gold threads, and the hairstyles that defied gravity, there was a woman. And this woman, despite the criticism, the scandals, and the eyes of the world on her, had a role that was perhaps the most sincere of her life, that of mother. Marie Antoinette had 4 children, and contrary to what many expected of a queen raised to act rather than feel, she loved each of them deeply. Her first child, the long-awaited daughter of France, was born after years of speculation. When she held the little girl in her arms for the first time, she cried, but it wasn't just joy. She cried because she had given birth to a daughter instead of a male heir, as the court had hoped. All of France wanted a dauphin, but Marie Antoinette, she just wanted to be a mother. Later, other children came along, including the long-awaited boy Louis-José, who would be the future heir to the throne. Beside him, the Queen was a different person. She would drop her commitments, sit on the floor to play, read stories, embroider clothes with her own hands, and she did something very rare for the time. She breastfed and raised her children with affection, without outsourcing everything to nannies. She even wrote letters to friends and family, telling them about her children's mischief, their first words, and the fevers that kept her awake at night. The Petit Trianon, her refuge, also became a home for her children's childhood, far from the rigidity of Versailles. But the joy would not last forever. The heir, Louis Joseph, fell ill with tuberculosis while still a child. His condition worsened as France collapsed into revolts and rumors. Marie Antoinette, now queen and a desperate mother, divided her time between public duties and tending to her son. When he died in 1789, she broke down. The pain of his loss was so profound that friends said something inside her had broken forever. And yet she remained steadfast for her other children, especially little Louis Charles, who would be proclaimed king in the midst of the revolution, and her daughter Maria Theresa, her faithful shadow in the darkest times. But destiny was already set, because while she buried a son in silence, the people marched in the streets shouting for justice, bread and blood. Imagine waking up in a palace surrounded by perfect gardens, musicians playing in the hallways, servants serving hot chocolate on fine china, and suddenly hearing a whisper that freezes the air. The Bastille has fallen. It was July 14, 1789, when the Bastille prison was stormed by thousands of Parisians armed with fury and courage. For many, it was just a symbol of the oppressive monarchy, but for the nobility, it was a battle cry. Marie Antoinette and Louis XVI were at Versailles, still trying to pretend that the world was moving along at the pace of the ballrooms. But the people weren't dancing, they were marching, with hunger, unemployment, absurd taxes, and a system that treated royalty as untouchable gods. The French decided to take the reins of history into their own hands, and the Queen became the main target. She still tried to keep up appearances. She still had the formal dinners, the fancy clothes, and the forced smile in the hallways. But inside, she knew something had changed forever. News of the fall of the Bastille spread like wildfire throughout France. Palaces were stormed, aristocrats fled abroad, and peasants seized castles. It was the beginning of the French Revolution, and for the first time, the idea of cutting off a king's head was no longer just a metaphor, and the people marched. On October 5, 1789, thousands of Parisian women, many with children in their arms, walked to Versailles demanding bread. But not just bread, they wanted to see the Queen, they wanted justice, they wanted blood. And that night, for the first time, Marie Antoinette looked out her window and saw the people at her door. The next day, forced by the revolutionaries, the king, queen, and their children were forced to leave the palace. Escorted by a crowd that called them thieves, traitors, and monsters, they went to Paris as prisoners of their own nation. It was the end of the monarchy, as Marie Antoinette knew it, and the beginning of a new phase, the slow, humiliating, and inevitable fall. But even as she watched the world crumble around her, the Queen still had one hope: to flee, to escape, to breathe again outside the walls of the revolution. They were surrounded, trapped in their own country. The King and Queen of France, now hostages in their own palace, guarded by revolutionaries and hated by an angry people. But there was still one trick up their sleeve: escape. It was June 1791. The plan was bold, almost impossible: flee Paris in disguise, cross the country, and reach the border with Austria, where royalist troops would be ready to protect them. Marie Antoinette and Louis XVI, together with their children, trusted servants, and a faithful Swedish ally, organized the greatest escape in French royal history. In the dead of night, they slipped out of the side doors of the palace in disguise, the king dressed as a chamberlain, the queen as a governess, the children as simple travelers, and they boarded a huge, heavy, noisy carriage, covered with curtains and blankets to hide their royal faces. But there was a problem. Royalty did not know how to live discreetly. The carriage was so luxurious and over the top that it drew attention wherever it went. The delay increased the tension. At each stop, the curious looks grew, and it was in a small town called Varennes, almost on the border, that the worst happened. A young man recognized the king. He had seen the monarch's face on the coins. He alerted the local revolutionaries. Barricades were set up. The royal family was detained and surrounded. Game over. The Queen, who had held out hope until then, sat still. She knew what this meant, not just the failure of a plan, but the end of the monarchy, of freedom, of the possibility of escape. Taken back to Paris as public prisoners, they were greeted with silence, a silence more terrifying than any scream. The people regarded them no longer as fallen leaders, but as traitors. They had tried to abandon France at the very moment when it needed them most. After the flight from Varennes, the last straw had fallen on the cup of popular patience. Trust was broken. The revolutionaries now had real grounds for demanding a trial, and the Queen's fate was no longer uncertain. It was sealed. But before the end, the cruelest spectacle would come. A public trial with unimaginable accusations, false testimonies, and a people crying out for justice with a thirst for revenge. After the escape attempt, the crown no longer shone and the cell was ready. Marie Antoinette was separated from her husband, her children, and the life she knew. From absolute queen, she began to live in degrading conditions in the conciergerie, the prison known as the antechamber to the guillotine. She slept on a hard cot, was watched day and night, and ate little if at all. There were no more luxuries, there was no advice, there were no allies, but the worst was yet to come. In October 1793, Marie Antoinette was brought to trial before the Revolutionary Tribunal. She was not just a former queen on trial, she was a symbol of the old order that needed to be erased. The accusations were cruel and often absurd. Treason, espionage for Austria, political manipulation, mismanagement of public funds, and to make things even more shocking, she was accused of incest with her own son, an accusation without any basis, but one that caused horror. When she heard this, she did not scream, she did not cry, she did not rebel. She simply turned to the audience and said firmly, "I appeal to all mothers." The audience, even though they were made up of revolutionaries, went silent. For the first time, there was not a queen there, but a wounded mother, a woman. The trial lasted 2 days, but the sentence was already written before the first day. Guillotine. Marie Antoinette was sentenced to death for treason, and her execution was scheduled for the following day. The night before, she had written a final letter to her sister-in-law, speaking of her love for her children and her hope for forgiveness. But the letter never reached its destination. It was intercepted and hidden, as if even her last words were too dangerous to read. On the morning of her execution, she was asked to change her clothes into a simple shirt. They cut off her blonde hair, tied her hands behind her back, and placed her in a cart, the same one used for common criminals. But even there, humiliated before the people who had once applauded her, she did not lower her head. October 16th, 1793. The sun rose pale over Paris. The air was heavy, the silence piercing. The city seemed to hold its breath. It was the day of the execution of Marie Antoinette, former Queen of France, now only prisoner number 280 in the conciergerie. In the cold, damp cell, she already knew that this would be her last dawn. The night before, she wrote a touching letter, her last confession. "I forgive my enemies. I hope my children will not forget me." But the letter never arrived. It was intercepted, read in secret, locked away in a vault of history for almost 2 centuries. That morning, they cut her hair short so that the guillotine blade would slide cleanly through it. They dressed her in a simple white shirt and tied her hands behind her back. She, who had once paraded in dresses embroidered with precious stones, was now led like any other condemned woman. Unlike her husband, Louis XVI, who was taken in a closed carriage, Marie Antoinette was placed in an open carriage, exposed to the mockery of the crowd. She walked the streets of Paris in silence, facing the shouts, the insults, the cruel jokes head-on, but she did not lower her eyes, she did not cry, she did not ask for mercy. He climbed the steps of the scaffold with firmness, even with his wrists bound. As he reached the top, he accidentally stepped on the executioner's foot and in a whisper said, "Forgive me, sir, I did not do it intentionally." These were his last words. At 12:15 p.m., the blade fell, and with it, not only did the head of a queen fall, an entire world fell. The crowd cheered, but some wept. Even among the most fervent revolutionaries, there were those who felt that something far beyond a body had been cut off. They cut off the era of absolute crowns. They cut off the illusion of untouchability. They cut off, at that moment, the head of a woman who had been a queen, a symbol, a scapegoat, and in the end merely human. Marie Antoinette's body was thrown into a mass grave in the Madeleine Cemetery, covered in quicklime, no tributes, no flowers, no name. But her story was far from over. Because over time, the memory of the beheaded queen would be rewritten, transformed, discussed and re-evaluated. When the guillotine fell in 1793, what everyone expected was the end of the queen, of the monarchy, of the arrogance of the nobility, and for a time it was. Marie Antoinette disappeared from the political scene, from official discourse, from commissioned paintings. But there was one thing the revolution could not erase: her image. Decades after her death, as the dust of the revolution settled and France regained its balance, she began to re-emerge, not as a villain, but as a tragic figure. The queen who was judged by all and heard by few. Letters, testimonies and diaries began to be revisited. Historians began to reread her life with eyes less infatuated with revolutionary hatred. What did they see there? A young woman torn from her childhood to fulfill a political destiny, thrown into a world she did not understand, pressured by impossible expectations, and transformed into a monster by mistakes that were not hers alone. For some, Marie Antoinette became a martyr of the monarchy, wronged, sacrificed as a symbol of a system that needed to die. For others, she continued to be an icon of the disconnect between the elite and the people, used to make us never forget what happens when power ignores hunger. And then came culture. Books, biographies, poems, operas, paintings. In the 19th century, her remains were exhumed and taken to the Basilica of Saint Denis, where they rest alongside those of other kings and queens of France. In the 20th century, she became a character in films, historical novels, and even fashion theory. Works appeared that portrayed her as a rebel, a victim, a fashionista, a misunderstood woman, and over time, it stopped being just a head cut off by the guillotine. It became something bigger, a mirror. A mirror where each generation sees what it wants to see: vanity, oppression, injustice, tragedy, resistance. But this reconstruction of the Queen's image is only complete when we look at the phenomenon that came later. If you think Marie Antoinette is stuck in the history books, think again. The Queen who had her head cut off by the guillotine became a style icon, a symbol of rebellion, the muse of music videos, films, fashion shows, and even memes. She died in 1793, but the 21st century seems unable to forget her. And it all started with the look. That image that was once used to ridicule her, the exaggerated dresses, the sky-high hairstyles, the "I'm rich and I can do it" air, became an inspiration. Designers like John Galliano, Vivienne Westwood, Karl Lagerfeld, and even Alexander McQueen drew on her aesthetic. Catwalks were filled with taffeta dresses, corsets, and white wigs, revisited with a modern twist. But it wasn't just fashion that fell in love. In 2006, director Sofia Coppola released the film Marie Antoinette, starring Kirsten Dunst as the Queen, and made history. The soundtrack? No harps or violins. It had The Strokes, Ozzy and the Banshees, New Order. Yes, alternative rock playing in Versailles. The film transformed the Queen into a sort of 18th century Tumblr girl, confused, pressured, suffocated, but also full of attitude. It gained cult status, divided opinions, but brought one thing to light. Marie Antoinette was more than a queen. She was a symbol of youth crushed by a system. She has also appeared in pop music videos, such as Madonna, Lady Gaga, and in editorials in Vogue and other fashion magazines. Even Barbie has had a Marie Antoinette version. And of course, memes, thousands. She has become a GIF, a figurine, a joke, and even inspiration for Halloween costumes with or without a head. The most curious thing, she, who was accused of living outside the reality of the people, became a portrait of modern culture. Striking looks, exposed life, public judgments, and distorted fame. Sound familiar? Influencers, celebrities, cancellations. She lived all of this before the internet existed. But after all this, the dresses, the gossip, the guillotine, and the pop culture, one final question remains. Who was Marie Antoinette really? After everything you've seen, heard, and felt so far, it's time to ask, who was Marie Antoinette after all? Was she the cold and vain queen who ignored the suffering of the people? Or was she the young woman torn from her childhood and thrown into the center of a bloody revolution? Was she a traitor or betrayed, unjust or wronged? Or perhaps just human? Marie Antoinette was a daughter, a wife, a mother, a symbol, a scandal, a myth. She lived in a time when women had no voice, but she was held accountable for every gesture. She was accused of mistakes she did not commit, silenced when she tried to defend herself, and turned into a monster by a society desperate for someone to blame. She was raised to be a political ornament, a piece on a chessboard of alliances. She married without choice, became queen without preparation, had children under pressure, and was watched until her last breath. Yes, she spent too much. Yes, she made mistakes, but she also loved her children deeply, was loyal to her friends, and climbed each step of the guillotine with dignity. Perhaps this is Marie Antoinette's greatest legacy. She is everything that history has hidden behind dresses and scandals. She is the reminder that behind the crowns there are people, and that even a queen, no matter how powerful she seems, can be arrested, judged, condemned, and still remain alive in the memory of an entire world. So now, the choice is yours. After everything you've seen, who is Marie Antoinette to you? Comment below. Do you see her as a martyr, a villain, or a woman lost in her time? Don't forget to like and share this episode with someone who loves history, and subscribe to the channel because there's still a lot of royalty, tragedy, and glory for us to discover together.